and welcome to the ICT Pulse podcast. I'm Michelle Marius, your host and the editor and publisher of ICT Pulse, the online platform where we discuss ICT issues from a Caribbean perspective. Welcome to our March 2021 community chat. Joining me today are Melissa Farara, who is an economist at the British Virgin Islands Telecommunications Regulatory Commission, and we also have Oshane Bailey, a software developer and the co-founder of the Jamaica Developer Community, who is based in Jamaica. Melissa and Oshane, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Same. Thank you for having me, Michelle.
In this community chat, our guests submitted the topics for discussion. First, what will it take for the Caribbean to become the next Silicon Valley, which Oshane will lead us through, and thereafter, what should be the starting point regulators, competition authorities take in this digital age, which Melissa submitted for discussion. Oshane, you're up to bat first. And again, the topic is what will it take for the Caribbean? And I'm sure for Oshane, he'll be talking a lot from the Jamaican perspective to become the next Silicon Valley. But Oshane, at least for the past decade, Caribbean countries, including Jamaica, have been saying that they want to be the next Silicon Valley. Clearly, we don't seem to be there as yet. And, what are your opening thoughts on that issue?
All right. So that's very interesting. But I think what we should look at first is basically the history. So a part of the problem why Jamaica, well, I should say Caribbean hasn't been the next Silicon Valley as yet is because they stem from the old culture of the Caribbean, especially for Jamaica. Jamaica, for example, is known for tourism and music and a nice chill spot for beaches, beautiful sunset, and so forth. And we also known for agriculture, amongst other things. So when it come on to technology, that's something we don't necessarily push out to the public. So the general public is unaware of what's happening in the tech ecosystem in Jamaica and the Caribbean at large, even though there are producers in the Caribbean that are in blockchain, game development, SaaS-based software solution, and so forth. So the issue is definitely one. There's a awareness issue where one, the government, the different government agencies in the different Caribbean islands are unaware of these big impact local tech communities, tech shops, and innovative companies are doing, as well as unaware of the development skills of citizens in the Caribbean. And because of that gap, it's not broadcast, it's not showcase, it's not streamlined to make the government or people within the Caribbean aware and basically can say, oh, individuals in the Caribbean can literally produce world class software solutions. And because of that lack of awareness, it stemmed in the confidence of tech companies and individuals in the Caribbean with basically these companies to produce. However, there are individuals, developers, and companies that have produced large scale software. Developers in Jamaica, for example, working at Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and some other big name companies. But at the same time, if there are these developers, tech shop that can, generate such large scale application and work for large international organization, then why hasn't it happened as yet? Why hasn't the Caribbean is the next Silicon Valley? The reason for that, apart from awareness, is basically the mindset. Mindset in the sense that we have like in Jamaica, for example, there's sort of a culture whereby one, when they look at a local tech company, they would pay a local tech company less, and we to go out and find international company and like pay them like billions of dollars. So there's a disconnect with basically what the government thinks, what the government is doing. And I think this replicates throughout all of the different Caribbean region. I'm not sure. I guess Melissa, you can talk about that after I make this point. If it's the same for BVI, but one is all government in the Caribbean talk about, improving technology, improving their infrastructure and so forth. There are people locally that can improve it, can work towards building better software solutions. However, they're not getting the projects, they're not getting the opportunity, and because there's so much reliance on like international aid or tech companies, the local tech shops aren't able to scale as large as possible because there's not enough support by the government, by basically the people in the Caribbean to push forward. Because someone honestly, most of us probably would prefer to use a software that is produced by a US company versus a Jamaican company or a Caribbean company. So, with that said, there's a shift that we need to make in the mindset of not just the people and consumers of technology, but as well as government agencies and others to basically look locally for these talented individuals and tech shops and innovation studios to basically build out those software solutions, because the more we end up producing locally, the better we will be looked at from a global scale to being a producer of software solutions, as well as, for example, last year with election, the Jamaica decides, as well as the election application that was produced by Codeware, that gave a lot of highlight that, oh yeah, there's really good developers in Jamaica, in the Caribbean. But it's something that in the tech ecosystem a lot of us already know. So the downplay on the whole Silicon Valley is whereby there's not enough support for these local tech communities, individuals, and so forth to scale at the rate that they need. So, of course, changing the mindset is one of the steps we need to take towards becoming the next Silicon Valley.
Absolutely. So, Melissa, what are your thoughts before I jump in?
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly with what O'Shane is saying. And our government in the BVI has talked about this issue a bit and has indicated that they too want the BVI to be the next Silicon Valley, just like Jamaica has explained. So I think there's different approaches that could be taken in this regard. I think that governments need to have a clear vision as to what the ICT and the nature of technology is going to do for the country. I think there needs to be a clear vision and expectations in how those resources, whether that's from abroad or from local companies, how that can impact the country as a whole. I think that there's a lot of research that could be done in terms of developing this better, whereby governments can create ministries specifically focusing on tech development. I think also that the skill sets that are put in place for ICT and for STEM research is in your big name countries and in your developing countries. However, I think those skill sets should be implemented in smaller countries like the Caribbean. So that could mean that an ICT hub could develop in a country, and therefore the likes of, say, Facebook or Google could come into the country and have the local people develop certain skill sets in technology for them to develop themselves. And who knows, they may want to spark and develop their own businesses because of this.
That's so true. I guess it just for my part. I mean, I certainly agree with O'Shane, and he made us so many points because I think that we have this sort of prejudice against local. So as he rightfully said, we would pay twice, three times, five times, whatever we are prepared to charge local developers to produce the same application that we would when compared to what we would pay somebody from outside of the region. And I think I think the biggest boost that Silicon Valley had at the time is the fact that they invested in themselves. I guess they would have had like a lot of government projects initially, which created this hotbed in a particular location that eventually became what we now know as Silicon Valley. But it really is about us, I think, one taking a little bit more pride as a region in what we can produce and the caliber of the skills that we have available. But I was also wondering, O'Shane, do you think that somehow we all say, oh, we want to be the next Silicon Valley, but we really don't know what it means? I mean, we may see, like the trappings in terms of, okay, you have all these big name companies located there, but is that really all that it is? What does that mean when you say that you want to be the next Silicon Valley?
All right. So to answer part of the question that you mentioned, there are a lot of individuals that would say and companies that would say next Silicon Valley as well as the government. But yes, there's definitely a misconception, not knowing what it takes and having that vision of building that infrastructure. When come on to garnering like that vision and the aspect of what it really means, it really drives from something that you mentioned earlier, that self-development, that space, that environment that allows innovators, creative thinkers to literally produce software solution, and there's this synergy between the public private sector that basically helps to build out like large scale systems that one the government needs, to the people in the nation needs required that we to solve community or human problems within a country. And three is basically having that support, not the mindset, the financial, and the method of growing these companies. Because, for example, there might be like a startup. There are plenty of tech startup in Jamaica, matter of fact, but the problem is, okay, these companies start to solve a problem, but there's a problem with the banking industry not having flexible means of, payment gateway. The government incorporate like 33% company tax. So in retrospect, what I'm saying is that to become the next Silicon Valley, it's more towards self-development, ability to basically the environment, ability to able to grow these tech startup, digital skills of software developers and digital professionals, as well as giving as much support. Because one of the thing I think a lot of tech startup face is finding funding, whether startup grant funding or so forth, because the building blocks of any single aspect component a nation is always the people, the companies and so forth. So if those can't grow, then all of this meaning for next Silicon Valley, the next vision or so forth is meaningless. You need to ensure that the building blocks of society, people and the companies and these simple technologies are able to grow and scale at a reliable and sustainable space.
Indeed. Melissa, any thoughts before I jump in?
Yes, I agree with what O'Shane has mentioned, especially in the fintech space where companies, small companies, are having issues in terms of receiving money from abroad, in terms of payments on their e commerce websites, for example. Those issues need to be ironed out. There needs to be a way that local companies can be able to receive money that they can get abroad from purchases on their websites. And how is the government be able to support these small local companies in that regard?
One of the things, though, that came to mind as you're talking, O'Shane, is the whole issue of staffing and getting the skills that you need. And yes, money is a challenge, getting the financing, but for businesses to scale, one, you need to have the staffing. And I think sometimes there can be, and I will say it as a criticism at this point, or it really is a challenge, and it may be one of these sort of chicken and egg situations where whether or not our developers are sufficiently skilled, and I'm not necessarily talking about it in terms of all developers, but you may have, of course, those that are the bright sparks who have really pushed themselves and so on, but then you may find that there's a sense that they may not have been always as exposed and always as cutting edge as one might need to work in that sort of environment where you're really looking to create some sort of innovative space, highly innovative space, which is what I think the whole sort of Silicon Valley concept is really about. What are your thoughts?
All right. So regarding the staffing, there are plenty of developers in Jamaica. You would, for example, produce over 1,200 computer scientists per individuals with tech background, engineers, computer scientists, and so forth per year. 9% of UTech graduates are basically from engineering department, and then there are thousands of developers working in the industry. So there's not a shortage regarding the quality now. There's a lot of quality developers, but what you're finding is that mass majority of these quality developers tend to one, leave the country and go somewhere else for better pay. Two, at a company that is large enough to sustain their growth and sustain the development challenges and solutions that they're producing. So literally at the end of the really good developers aren't available because they're taken up by large companies or international companies. So what happened is that because UA and these different universities are producing X amount of students, and then technology is something that anyone can get into, anyone can learn. It's literally like our main language for like the Caribbean, which is English. So there's going to be, of course, like a 60-40, where there's a lot of good English speakers and a good amount of people who don't speak it well. So developers are like that, but at the same time, everything is a stage. It's a growth opportunity. They start out within their first couple 1-2 years with the basic knowledge, and as the years go by, as they're doing more project, getting opportunities, a developer can literally upskill themselves to an advanced developer within a 2 year or three. So, but as soon as they're like advanced, they either think about leaving or finding a job that really can pay them, because the Caribbean overall don't necessarily know the true value of tech and digital systems in terms of and this is a short point that I'm going to make. In terms of Silicon Valley, the whole concept of it is the mindset, the environment, to support digital movement and advancement in technology. There are less dampeners, there's less strict restrictions for technology and startup to scale. So that's basically why, like, the Caribbean has not yet become the so-called next Silicon Valley, because there's too many dampeners and restriction for developers and companies for us to really grow and make true impact.
Okay. Melissa, I wanted to ask a question though, and probably O'Shane, you can jump in thereafter because if, for example, a lot of the developers, and maybe it is not the responsibility of the developers to be looking for jobs, whether or not it's locally or internationally, because I think besides the quality of the skills that are available in Silicon Valley is the whole sort of entrepreneurial spirit, the innovative spirit, and therefore, in an environment where there's a certain appetite for risk. And I'm not sure that certainly our countries are ready for that, because if we are looking at the developers to really be the ones to be driving this whole Silicon Valley concept, we might be sorely mistaken, and it's really is supposed to be the entrepreneurs who are the ones who are driving it, but supported by developers and all of the expertise that they require to bring their businesses to life. What do you think?
Yes, it takes a multi stakeholder approach in order to solve this issue for the Caribbean. I think governments need to have a vision, but I think they need to be aware of the issues that entrepreneurs and developers are facing in their local context. And I think that government should spend significant money in terms of how they can improve in this regard. You know, persons leaving Caribbean countries and going abroad to for better pay and for better jobs is something that has been happening for years and years, and it's not just based on the technology sector. So I think governments need to really focus and look at, could we give scholarships to persons in this regard so that they can develop the skills and bring those skill sets back? Is there training that needs to be done whereby those persons that went to Google or went to Facebook can come home and educate young entrepreneurs and developers to teach them the skills that they need so that they can develop their own businesses? And is there online education programs that local students who want to study computer science or engineering, are there programs that they're just not aware of that they can use to develop those skills that they need?
To touch on a point that you made, so as mentioned before, tech is something that very easy to get in, especially since there are thousands of online materials. Funnily, Jamaican developers community, which soon be rebranded to more of a Caribbean scope, we've been doing like training, we've been doing like tutorials, and we've been inviting like companies, international companies, to come and do training events with Jamaican students, companies, and so forth. So yes, that's something that from the government point of view, they recognize, and they start, well, at least in Jamaica there's the, I think it's called Amber Academy. I don't know if it's still on because of the old data breach, but yes, they started to think about it, but at the same time, from a developer point of view, the approach wasn't well thought out. That synergy between, okay, the tech industry in Jamaica and the government, there should be that connection whereby the government can reach out to a group of the tech companies having like a tech committee or something and ask, okay, what's the state of the landscape of technology in Jamaica or the Caribbean? What do we need? What do you think we should do? What type of training and so forth do we should we provide? So it does seem like that hasn't been happening in the Caribbean, and that's basically our mindset we need to change to get the right people, the developers, the decision makers, and the ones that can train and scale both developers, digital professionals, entrepreneurs, and so forth to take on a larger project or produce large scalable software solution to the world. So yeah, there it has been some training, but there hasn't been like a true vision of the approach to take. And even if there's something, there's always some form of political gains or reason why it didn't work. Right? There was Startup Jamaica that was focused on tech entrepreneurs, whether it's developers or innovators, but that failed because of political reasons. There's a bunch of other examples that I can bring up, but everything stems from awareness and mindset.
Absolutely. Folks, I think we have to leave this topic and move on to the next one. So, Melissa, you're up with the topic again being what should be the starting point for regulators, competitions, authorities in this digital age. And, Melissa, as you know, you would be aware the telecoms regulatory frameworks in most of the Caribbean countries are dated. Many of them primarily focus on fixed line and mobile services, and the internet and all of the attendant issues you have been grappling with over the past several years are not adequately addressed. But because those frameworks are so dated, there seems to be a huge chasm between where we are and where we need to be. What are your thoughts?
Yes, most definitely. And this stems from the fact that innovation starts first and then regulation follows afterward. And so you see in the developing world, developed countries have started to focus on 5G and start to implement that in their countries bit by bit. South Korea has started, now the United States and the UK have implemented it a bit. And countries are slowly having discussions on what is the approach that we should be taking for 5G and the endless possibilities that 5G can bring to the country and for economic development as well.
O'Shea, do you want to jump in before I add my 2 cents?
No, you can go first.
Okay, then. All right. So, yes, Melissa, I definitely agree. But I also wonder, because you made a point about innovation starts first and regulation follows, but could there be also the challenge of innovation being hampered by the existing regulation? And that now is not allowing, the regulation then to develop as it should, or as would be desired to facilitate the innovation.
Sure. So I think countries need to, and when I say countries, I mean the regulators, need to really focus on what are the bottlenecks and what are the issues that would hamper the next stage of development, which is 5G. Are the infrastructures in place to support the capability as data is becoming more and more used? Is your internet framework strong and secure? So that would mean in terms of cybersecurity threats, are countries focusing on mitigating those threats? And do we have the cooperation with the operators, the regulators and the operators to have this vision? There needs to be a vision for countries to have in terms of getting to the digital age. And that needs to be meetings with government, with regulators, and from operators and from consumers as well to hear how the digital age can impact their lives.
Alright. So another thing to think about, because like 5G is a very interesting topic. One, apart from the whole, infrastructure requirements to develop the 5G networks and so forth, which will be very, 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 very expensive to do, especially if we're doing it within like a 5 year, 10 year range, because there are still a lot of old technology that we're using for these cell towers and so forth. So the interesting part is, okay, can we afford it? Are we really ready for 5G? Because if you think about it, like the Caribbean, I'm not sure if BVI has high internet speed, but technically, what we have in Jamaica and most likely a lot of Caribbean country is still 4G. Not in 4G, less than 4G. It's more like HSPA plus, which is like close to 4G, but it's actually not 4G. So because of like we're not having like LTE speed or 4G speed as the US, can we really make that shift to 5G? Can we really afford it? Are we really ready for it? And then the whole, at the end of the day, how is it going to be paid for?
Yes, because 5G is very expensive to roll out. There's high costs to develop this infrastructure and put it into the grounds. For example, the number of base stations to cover the same area for 5G requires more base stations than you would on 4G. So there needs to be some public-private partnerships and encouraging infrastructure sharing agreements between the operators so that the cost of that infrastructure could go down and possibly find new creative ways in terms of funding the significant cost that 5G will incur in a country.
But I guess, but while that is so, and I mean, O'Shane made a really valid point. I was so proud of you, O'Shane, when you mentioned about just the cost element and the fact that, we really may not be getting true 4G or 4G LTE speeds, at least consistently in the region, even in our home countries, and certainly even at a particular location. You may find that, you know, during the day it varies, and it's not necessarily consistent. So I really wonder whether or not we are being too ambitious. And I guess I'm probably almost playing devil's advocate, where you want to move to the 5G, but even all of the other bits and pieces that are required to get us there. Because I mean, 5G is a technology, but does the regulatory infrastructure, the regulatory support, the regulatory framework, does it really not necessarily just support 5G, because 5G in itself is just a technology, but all of the services that you can facilitate and support on top of a port on that technology.
Yes, yes. There are significant issues that regulators really need to focus on to get their infrastructure up to par. There are certain bottlenecks in the internet infrastructure that needs to be tackled so that you can get the relevant speeds needed. These issues could be in terms of adequate spectrum, enough capacity in and around the country. These are the different things that countries should be looking at. And as communication sort of converges over time, there needs to be significant impact as to what the regulator can do to incentivize operators to move forward in addressing these bottlenecks. These would need to be done by doing various market analysis. If there's any anti-competitive behavior or dominance issues, this needs to be addressed in terms of the infrastructure itself and also any consumer policy issues that need to be addressed as well.
Very interesting. There's another question that related to something that you said. But before actually, before we get there, a better question which goes towards the all, are we ready? Do you think like 5G technology, like implementing it and so forth, would solve the coverage rate that we have in Jamaica? Well, not Jamaica, but the Caribbean overall. Because of course, like for example, I'm trying to remember the stats off my head. If I remember correctly, Jamaica has 61% internet penetration. I don't remember the figure for the Caribbean, but basically there's still a large amount of the region, Caribbean region, that lacks internet accessibility. So given that, like, there's so many problems with coverage, do you think we really should go towards 5G? Would 5G solve the issue? I know that it can probably cover a larger range, especially with the routers and the dish that's provided, but would it really solve the issue of accessibility and penetration?
Those are such good questions, O'Shane. Because just to sort of emphasize it, because are we wanting 5G just to say that we have the latest or the best? What might be some of the benefits that we would get as a region in having 5G? And that, I think, is a very important question that we may need to answer.
Yes, I think that regulators need to really look at what are the bottlenecks in the infrastructure itself. The coverage that 4G is given, is it in all areas of the country? That's where universal service obligations needs to be put in place if it's not in a country already, and it needs to look at, well, are rural areas having 4G? Are they having the speeds that operators are selling these packages on? Because it's okay to say that we have 4G and a customer is paying a package and only getting a certain level of speed. But when they go home and, demands of the pandemic, for example, and other demands impacts their lives, the internet is strained and therefore they're not getting the speeds that they require. And this issue is something that regulators should look at to say, well, how can we incentivize the operators to make sure that they are providing the guaranteed speeds that these packages provide?
Absolutely. But Melissa, even looking a little further, because one of the challenges that we currently have with the regulatory framework, and primarily for the telecoms regulatory framework, as opposed to, let's say, competition for now, is that it looks at infrastructure. So the whole focus on speed, coverage, well, not even so much. There's not a lot that is being done in the region, to my knowledge, to address that in terms of the actual quality of service, especially as it relates to internet. When it was fixed line, whether or not how long it takes you to get a line, if your line you don't have service, what should be the maximum time within which service should be restored. A lot of those things were done for the fixed line infrastructure, but not necessarily for internet and all of these sort of newer technologies that we are having to grapple with. But the bigger point that I wanted to raise is the whole issue of content regulation, and maybe the other layers on top of the infrastructure that now seem to require some sort of attention. Now, for example, whether or not is the fact that the providers, our telcos, are saying that over the top services should be regulated, the YouTubes and the Netflixes, all of these sort of major content providers, and therefore large consumers of their bandwidth should be charged something for accessing their networks. But this is not something that our regulatory frameworks considers at all. Whether or not it should is another thing, but the fact of the matter is that we haven't had the regulatory revisions and that sort of exercise to even to begin to consider those options. And I think though that there is infrastructure elements that we have been speaking about a lot. But as we move, and you spoke about convergence, what about, whether or not it's content, not necessarily in terms of what maybe like ministries of information are doing, but there's other layers that we now need to also consider, and not necessarily the infrastructure alone.
That's definitely correct, and discussions need to be had within the region to figure out, is over the top services putting competitive pressure on the traditional operators of your in the region, Lime, Digital, and any other smaller operators, because operators may say that they are competing, and what are regulators doing about it? Now, regulators need to understand that what are the trends that are happening. Communication is converging, we're using more data, and internet apps, more and more persons are using internet apps. And therefore, these changes are happening in the marketplace. We need to be aware of them. And is competition law sufficient enough in its current form to tackle these issues? And my answer to that is no, because regulators would have to intervene to figure out the best approaches on how efficient a market would function. And that would be done with a market analysis by setting your market definition, your assessment of market power, and then your proposed remedies. But the infiltration of digital age shows that the regulatory frameworks aren't yet using the existing frameworks. There are challenges in terms of the existing frameworks to assess these sort of players in the market. And therefore, this specifically would come about in when you're doing a SNP test, a small intransitory increase in price. So we would measure an operator and say that if your price increases, what is the competitive effect that would happen, and what is there any substitutability in the products that you provide to put competitive pressure on you. And therefore, with the dynamics of the regulations in place in that regard, your content providers and your over the top services aren't selling their customers a specific price, and therefore, that is an antitrust problem involving platforms where regulators will now have to look at non pricing issues as a threat to innovation and as a possible threat to the traditional market players in a market.
Indeed. Indeed. O'Shane, you have anything, any thoughts, any other questions?
Well, honestly, after hearing all of that, I'm just worried about the internet bill that I will see. That's literally it. Because like, no matter how much we may say that 5G is good, we need it in place and so forth. It's like GCT, right?
So, sorry, and for those who don't know, GCT is general consumption tax that is paid in Jamaica. In other countries, I guess it's VAT,
Yeah.
value added tax, and there are others, GST. I'm not sure, I can't remember what GST is right now, but yes, those sorts of taxes that are usually added to retail bills, consumer bills. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification and additional information. So yeah, it's like GCT. So what will happen is the company like these telecommunication companies and operators and so forth, everyone basically is relying on someone for some form of manufacturing parts, like whether cell tower or so forth, service from another supplier, and there's just going to be markup going up for each supplier. So by the time these telecommunications systems start to implement and get contractors to build out these infrastructure, all of what they're doing is going to be a significant cost. And of course, who is going to pay for that like all of this? Of course the consumer, the company will pay a chunk, yes, but they'll make it back in a very interesting way. For example, one could say like our electricity company JPS, I probably shouldn't really call them out like that. Like there's some significant spikes in electricity bill, which makes you wonder. So, well, internet bill tend to be fixed, but at the same time, there's there's always something that seems strange. So at the end of the day, how will this impact the affordability of internet access in the Caribbean? That's basically it. Especially since like probably 50% of the Caribbean don't have internet, and we're trying to move towards a digital age. How does it, the return on investment caters for the mass majority having internet access, reliable internet access, and can afford it? So that's all I'm thinking about, as well as the time it will take to literally build out that infrastructure, knowing that we still don't have internet access. Like for example, there are some schools that definitely rely on internet. Yet in the rural area, there are a lot of schools in Jamaica that don't have internet access, that needs it to supply their students with lab computers that they can do like a simple Google search to do their homework and so forth. It's basically, what do you think we should do? Focus on still building out the 4G infrastructure, or focus mainly on 5G, or try to create a synergy between the two to ensure affordability coverage while we still improve the whole infrastructure? What are your thoughts on that?
I think operators need to look at the fact that are they receiving return their investment with the current infrastructure that they have in place right now. We don't know if they are receiving a return on their investments, especially with the impacts of the hurricanes, Hurricane Irma and Maria, that have devastated significant portions of the Caribbean in 2017. In terms of the high costs aspect, I think that we need to find creative ways as regulators to figure out how can we lower the costs that input into an internet service. For example, is it that we need to use green technologies like solar energy? We're in the Caribbean; it's a warm climate. Should these be put in place to help to lower the costs in certain bottlenecks and in certain whether that's a base station or a cable network? We need to find creative ways to lower the costs because the cost of internet is significantly high in BVI and across the Caribbean.
So, as we begin to wind this down, what are going to be some of our takeaways from here? Because I certainly think that O'Shane may be onto something, because this whole issue of affordability is going to be a challenge. The deployment, as you said, Melissa, is going to be expensive. You're going to need a higher concentration of, base stations and communication points to actually provide the, I guess, the mesh that is needed to facilitate 5G. So I think that we really are going to have, to give some serious thought to this. And as we have been saying, it cannot necessarily just be just the infrastructure that we focus on, because 5G in and of itself is supposed to do so much more than what we're doing, and it's not necessarily just a fact that we're just getting a little upgrade in the technology, as probably has been the case for some of the different ones that we have enjoyed in the past. And even I think with 4G, we may not necessarily have even seen the full benefits of what 4G is supposed to offer. All it looks like it is just an upgrade from 3G and what we would have experienced before. So, Melissa, since this was your topic, and just kind of give us your sort of final thoughts as we decide, whether or not, or the extent to which how we may begin to grapple with what is to come, and how we need to position ourselves as we continue in this digital age.
Yes, thank you. I think regulators need to look at their countries and their operators and the competitive landscape to see whether market assessments need to be done in terms of different aspects of the entire internet infrastructure, from the home all the way to submarine cables heading out to other countries. I think there needs to be incentives for increased capacity where customers are experiencing poor quality of service. There needs to be tackles in terms of universal service to make sure everyone can get the level of service that is needed. I think that there needs to be regulations improved to see that how changes in terms of competition assessments need to focus on how 5G and all the benefits that 5G will bring to a country that move beyond smartphones and into other industries like healthcare and transportation. How can those regulations be put in place in the foreseeable future to ensure that we have better service from as we move from 4G to 5G.
And on that note, thank you so much, O'Shane and Melissa. O'Shane, thank you again for just, bringing us back to think about this whole Silicon Valley sort of concept, because it's something, as I said, sometimes you hear it so much and you hear it from your policymakers and you sort of roll your eyes because it's almost as if, it's just words. But, I think what you're trying to say to us is that there is actually some method and certain things that we can do to actually move us closer to that goal if we are serious about it. And Melissa, I think, 5G is just so topical, and we often find that we are just trying to get what everybody else is having, to just be on par with what we consider our neighbors. But whether or not we actually have the structures in place to really help us to fully leverage it and, even leapfrog our economies and our societies, sometimes I don't think those things are being given the attention. So thank you for, again, just coming and beginning to prompt us to think about these things. And certainly the questions that were asked, I think, were quite provocative, and hopefully would be food for thought for those who are listening. So thank you both again for joining me today.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you very much.
That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to the ICT Pulse podcast. You can find links to some of the things we talked about on our website, ict-pulse.com. If you like this episode, please show your support by leaving us a review on iTunes, as it will help others find the show. You can email us at info@ict-pulse.com or drop us a note on our Facebook page, facebook.com/ICTPulse, or via Twitter @ICTPulse. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode. Take care.